Warm welcome also from my side here to Let's Talk About Interoperability. As you know, our human voice is one of the most comprehensive carriers of information. And voice technology is on the rise as one of the most promising new digital communication paradigms. And today's digital world is the result of interoperability standards. Today, we'd like to discuss with worldwide experts how interoperability can drive the future of voice. I'd like to welcome Monica Lam from Stanford University, John Stine from the Open Voice Network OVON, Bret Kinsella from Voicebot.ai, Misha Zivkovic from Swisscom, and Reghu Thanumalayan from Deutsche Telekom. We will take a little bit more time here for an introductory round, and I'd like to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and bring a little bit more detail to your background and, of course, what's your specific interest in interoperability. Let's start with Monica.
Okay. Well, I'm Monica Lam. I'm a professor in the computer science department at Stanford University. And my research area is AI, machine learning, and natural language processing. So the goal of my research is to make it easy for every company and every organization to have its own conversational agent cost effectively. Okay. So we have been working on a set of tools. So if you just give me the database schema, like here's a flight table or a flight database, and we'll give you an agent that can talk to consumers about booking a flight. It is that easy. I would give that to you as a start, and then you build from then on. And the reason is that we believe if everybody has tools to make these conversational agents, then there will be a lot more participants who can build up an ecosystem that supports interoperability and provide privacy and choice. So, for example, we use this tool and we have built an open source virtual assistant that we have put out there. It's completely open, and I hope that this is a way to get a lot more people participating in interoperable ecosystems.
Thanks, Monica. And we're moving over to John.
John Stine, Executive Director of the Open Voice Network. We're the open source community of the Linux Foundation dedicated to development of technical standards and usage guidelines for the future of voice. And why is this important? What this interoperability question? I think it's really what future do we want? If we see that voice is this remarkably natural, easy, everyone can do it interface into potentially the digital world, how big do we want that digital world of voice to be? Monica is doing great research, and we're adopting and we support her vision of a worldwide voice web, and I know she'll speak to that here later today. But it is voice as a connection to every digital destination, not only that within, let's say, big tech channels, but to the world of websites, to the world of enterprise conversational assistants, and ultimately to the world of the metaverse. It's a world of voice as a connection to billions of destinations. So Malta, with that, that's what we see, and that's what we're working toward. And interoperability, the key to that extensive, expansive, exponential growth world of voice.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. We're moving over to Bret.
Hello. So I'm Bret Kinsella. I'm founder of Voicebot.ai. We are, I think, pretty much recognized as the leading analyst and news source for the conversational AI, voice AI industry. I've been in this space since 2013, building custom assistants after Siri, before Alexa, if you can think about that time period, and have had everyone except for Malta on this panel on my podcast at one time or another. I thank them all for doing that because they've done a really great job educating the market. And that's really one of the things that we're interested in. I'm really happy we're having this session today because I think this concept of interoperability it might seem a little dry to a lot of people, and so therefore it doesn't really get enough attention. But as John and Monica have said, it's really important. And Reghu and I have had a lot of conversations about this. In fact, Magenta Voice Assistant was one of the very first to have multiple assistants on a device. And I thought that was really a seminal moment. And there haven't been that many since. And so the question is, why is that? So I think I'm going to come here today as a neutral party in terms of saying I'm not a interoperability absolutist, but I do think that there's a lot of really good reasons why that's going to happen. And I believe that in many ways, that because when we have silos like we have in this industry, particularly around some of the general purpose consumer assistants, it actually inhibits growth. And that's not good for the consumer. At the same time, there are times when we want these siloed solutions because they're very efficient. And so I'll come at it and be happy to talk about both perspectives on this. But my view is, in general, interoperability is good, and there are some instances where not having interoperability is okay.
Thanks, Bret. And Misha, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm working as a product manager and program manager at Swisscom. In past years, I have been working on some technology edge projects, starting with around the infrastructure, and then from 2015, my involvement in voice started with building just plain voice search, and then in 2019 we have built in just a bit over 10 months custom voice assistant. And when we talk about interoperability, for me, the first thing as an engineer, I think about standards and how would creating those standards help in growing voice. And in the second thought, as a product manager, I always think about how those standards would help us in terms of platform to platform communication, how to build or manage several voice assistants or not. How would that simplify our use case? And we had some experience in past. We did consider in 2019 and 2018 during the project setup time, and what I can only say about interoperability is that it was just missing. And latest initiatives from John and from other community leaders, something like OVN, Open Voice Networks, really excites me, as I think it might bring more light or simplify and grow voice, where I think, and I agree, and I can echo only what my predecessors were saying, to grow voice and use it in whatever area we are implementing it. My take in that is exactly that.
Thanks a lot, Misha. Yeah. And Reghu, your time.
Thank you, Malte. I'm Reghu. I lead the Deutsche Telekom's voice assistant efforts. So we have been building the German voice assistant Magenta, focused on telecom domains for some years now. And when you think about interoperability, that for me is a bit like this invisible glue that exists everywhere if you just look around. Interoperability and standards are there in telecommunication networks, railroads, internet, the World Wide Web, a lot of places where it brings a lot of parties together for the benefit of the customer, right? And we view from Deutsche Telekom's point of view, interoperability along the same line, which is how can we do best for customer experience? And Bret mentioned that when we launched the Telecom Smart Speakers, I think we were the first one in the world to have two parallel assistants, meaning two parallel coexisting assistants, Magenta and Alexa, on the same device, even though there were a lot of technical challenges which we had to overcome. At the end, for us, it was quite simple. From a customer point of view, there are things Magenta can do and there are things Alexa can do, and we want to provide the choice to the customers. that they could use either of or both of them to basically, do what they want with the voice AI. So that's why I think interoperability for us is quite core, and we have been following a lot of discussions in the domain, starting with Open Voice Network, and we've been happy to get involved there, not just from contributing ideas, but also in terms of implementation and to see some real work happening. And which is why I'm happy today to have a very open discussion about, why interoperability is important, and do we really see that this is getting the attention that it should be getting, or it's not, and then how can we get there? So this is quite an important discussion for us at Deutsche Telekom.
Thanks, Reghu. So my first question I'd like to address to John. So when we think of the World Wide Web, if you think back like 20, 25 years, so the very first time we had a lot of, let's say, a handful of different standards like Gopher. And once the World Wide Web occurred, it was one of the main success factors of the huge uptake of the World Wide Web adoption. Is there something like the World Wide Web for voice? Or the other question is there a kind of TCP IP for voice? Or do we have any kind of overarching, widely accepted agreement of which to build voice service upon?
Malte, thank you for the question. And I would say we collectively are working toward that. And I think it's important to note, and Monica, I'm going to steal just a bit from you, but Dr. Lamb in her work has identified there's a number of ways that we can define interoperability. And, one of those is addressed by the Amazon Voice Interoperability Initiative. Several of those are being addressed by Dr. Lamb's work. Several of those are being addressed by overlapping work, and we have such great respect for Monica and her work. We're bringing, a number of those pieces into the Open Voice Network. We're working toward an approach, Malte, that broadly would be addressing the 4 to 5 different ways we can define interoperability in voice, and we're working toward that. Currently, there is an approach to having multiple assistants on a single device. That exists, and the Amazon Voice Interoperability Initiative does that quite well. But moving beyond that, of sharing data and dialogue, and then moving, and doing that across multiple, let's say, ecosystems, that's in front of us. And Dr. Lamb has some published approaches to that. We in the Open Voice Network are working toward some protocol specifications that would enable that. And so moving in a direction of a light, usable, feasible, and scalable approach to enabling the sharing of data, dialogue, context, and control. That's in front of us, and I think we'll be seeing, we have that from Dr. Lamb, we'll be seeing that from the Open Voice Network in the next months. First 1.0, 0.1 approaches to that come July and August this year. Exciting prospects before us, but the work is, a lot of the work is before us.
Adding to what John said, I think I really see that there are 2 ways where, standards emerge and drive commercial and consumer adoption, right? If you look at the internet and the World Wide Web and all those protocols, it was pretty much a very technical, technology-driven thing where the standards were basically there before commercial and consumer adoption started. There are other cases like with voice assistants where the industry or the business kind of started putting in out ecosystems there, which are very closed. And then you kind of come to the frictions in customer experience, and then you start thinking about, how can we bring them all together? So I think for us, it's a bit of the other way around, where we have established voice assistants with scale and with impact, worldwide. We're now trying to see how can we bring it together, which is a bit more difficult in my view than starting from something like the internet or the World Wide Web, where the standards exist. And I mean, they did a really great job in that, because those standards, which were kind of established in the 80s and 90s, still underpin most of the work. So I think that was really pioneering work in terms of thinking ahead. What we are doing is a bit of the other way around, right? Where there are existing stuff and then we are trying to make them work with each other.
I think there is a huge difference between the World Wide Web and what we, this voice assistance. And that is because it is so easy, so difficult to put up voice interfaces. Whereas when you talk about the www, what you have to do is just to create some HTML files, and put it up, and you're on the web. But it is not that easy to make voice interfaces, and this is where we come in. And we believe that the cost of the development, if you look at Alexa and Google today, they are still doing mainly single commands. But you really, if you really want to conduct business, like what people do on the World Wide Web, you have to have a conversation. I want to be able to order this and so forth. So the technology is a main key. But the good news, however, is that on one hand we are making this technology much more accessible, and we're now working with companies to use this technology. This is the beginning, and we hope that because it is open source, a lot of people can work together and we can move this forward. The second part here is that the good news is with existing World Wide Web, we can leverage on top of that. Everybody can use a search engine to find all kinds of websites. There are billions of websites out there. And the proposal I have with the World Wide Voice Web is to be able to just attach your agent once you build one as is kind of like a well-known URI off the page that you have. So in other words, we can solve the discovery problems really quickly because we are leveraging the World Wide Web. And what we now need to do is to make it very easy for people to just create their voice interfaces. And if everybody puts their information up on their own website, and it is open to anybody who is building any open, any virtual assistants, then you get an interoperability in a very deep, in a deeper way. You don't have to call up different assistants to talk to them because there will be a general assistant, and you can refer to all the different services that are provided by all the different companies.
This reminds me, Monica, on open infrastructure projects, which were back then starting when all the cloud interested parties joined together forces, and some of the work done in open infrastructure was coming from academia. And it was accepted by the business, and it's something which we already use in Swisscom in terms of infrastructure. And that's why I think it's a noble idea. What we need to find is, I think, at least the right approach for telcos to be able to implement the voice for their own needs, because at the end it's all about differentiation, providing users whatever are the key targets for each one of us. For me, it's we currently started big. We had a voice assistant, or ideas to have a voice assistant much larger than just on the TV box. At this point of time, it is part of the TV product. We do enable or extend the search and provide the customers and with a better experience, and that's one of our main goals. But I'm just thinking what my feeling is. We did so as a voice community and people involved in the edge technology, we've seen a great leap in 2017 and 2018. What I would wish to see, or let me say, people working in the project, another leap in the voice where it will be simpler for customers to interact. And then at the end, in terms of interoperability, we have some initiatives today. Let's mention Amazon interoperability initiative. I think it's great what's happening now with voice, but I'm still waiting for not waiting, let's say, I would wish that the next step in terms of the voice technology and recognition is there, so we can reuse the dialogues and we can make it simpler for our customers in terms of user experience. some of the challenges. There is one question, if I may just say a sentence about that. Was challenges we have in case imaginably that we wanted at the beginning of the project to have maybe even 2 voice assistants. It was one of the questions, but some of the researches and feedbacks which we have from the control groups, and also we in the projects, we were estimating that it's not easy to explain customers which domain is supported by which assistant. That would be one challenge. I'm not saying it's unbridgeable or unsolvable, just saying. And also there were fears about cannibalizing our own assistant if, for example, another market leader is too much better than us with 50,000 skills and everything. What I can say as a quick feedback, we have seen, and there were research showing that our customers who have Alexa are still using more Swisscom for their daily or switching. My apologies. Stuff than Alexa. So I think the custom voice assistants, they have their chance, and there is motivation on our side to proceed developing it, and we'll see how the technology goes with the group and with the whole voice enthusiasts, which I find all of us here, and we will play along. We can't, as a telco, define the standards, but we can surely support them when there is a motivation. So I think people here in this group are fantastic for this conversation, and I'm happy to be part of this exchange, because I believe like this we are creating standards. It's moving forward.
Thanks, Misha. My next question goes to Bret. Just like, imagine I am a CTO or a CIO of a company. What would you recommend in terms of decisions I now have to take regarding bringing forward my voice initiative in my company? Oh, you muted.
Depends on what industry you're in, but I'll take it as a general prospect. So the first thing that I would suggest is you do want to create an assistant, but one of the things that I just put out last week is I'm trying to get people to develop some finer definitions around what voice is, because between Siri and Alexa, and then later maybe Google Assistant, but between those, they set the stage where everyone thinks voice now is an assistant. And it's often misapplied because, as Monica mentioned, most of what's being used, in fact, if you look at 9 of the top 10 use cases on smart speakers, they are single shot. They're not multi-turn interactions. And so it's actually using voice much more like a command and control or a user interface. It's a point and click user interface. You're just using basically a voice mouse in this case. And so the first thing I tell them is say, okay, depending on what your objectives are, you really need to think about your strategy. And there's 3 categories of things you might want to use. You might want to use a voice interface, and you might want to use a voice assistant, or you might want to use an agent, voice agent. And so the voice interface really does allow you to do that command and control, this single shot. You ask for something, it comes back, very dependent on a services model. It's deterministic in the way you program it. Then you move into the voice assistant, where you're handling more complex things. And that might be very important for you to be able to service a customer, gather more information, provide more complex services, and also maybe tap into dynamic services on the back end that can fulfill the need better. And then the third is an agent, which would actually do things proactively for a user. Now, that's not going to be appropriate for all CTOs, but for some organizations, being able to have this assistant that can work on your behalf when you're not there, either analyzing or actually committing actions on your behalf, is the height of convenience, right? So one of the things that I think we probably all agree on in this panel is that the trend toward computing over the last 2 decades has been towards convenience. And voice has a tremendous ability to do that. But sometimes what I would just say is that CTOs are, based on the existing paradigm and the way the vendors talk about things, they say, oh, well, let's just put an assistant in, when that might be over-engineering the solution or under-engineering the solution. And then in terms of interoperability, and I'll close on this point, that's the one thing I will comment is that most organizations initially for what they're trying to accomplish are not incentivized for interoperability. It's extra effort, and they generally have very narrow objectives in mind, and they can serve those much better by not adding all of this complexity. Plus, as I wrote in Harvard Business Review 4 years ago, really their incentives are to control that front door and not to take their customers off to somebody else who might then snag them away, and they wouldn't be able to maintain that attention or authority that they want to have. And so, but that's okay. I think people need to understand that up front, to say that, okay, sometimes they're going to have these sort of closed off systems, but ultimately, particularly if you're a specialty player, but this is true for everybody, general purpose as well, there's going to be other services that you want to access. And many of those other services will be accessible most effectively through potentially other assistants. And so longer term, it's a much better solution for you to have that interoperability option, even if your initial implementation is much more of a siloed model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead, Monica.
That reminds me of the AOL days, right? At the beginning of the web, you're saying, okay, here, you just have to come to us and we'll make sure that we give you all the connections and these are all secure and recommended and so forth. And we rejected that, right? I mean, because voice, because the web is too big for that. Everybody wants to participate. They don't want to be controlled by some single player. And voice is even bigger in that sense because it reaches everybody and not just the people who are tech savvy. Okay. And I think, I really believe it is too big to be controlled by a single party. And so instead of a picture where I will have many, many assistants listening to me, every assistant is waiting for a wake word and they're listening in on what we are saying. Okay. And so what you really like to have is a neutral player at the bottom, and then you can get access all kinds of different services, different agents, and different assistants and different skills, just like what we are doing on a browser where we can go and visit every single web page.
So Monica, I'd like just to follow up on that because I think we did reject the AOL model until it was the Apple App Store. Right. And so mobile gives us that opposite view of where people were okay with not having interoperability and only having two choices. With that said, I'll just go back to this other thing because this will be controversial enough. And that there's this ongoing debate about one voice assistant to rule them all or multiple voice assistants more in an app model. What we're seeing right now is more the app model of voice assistants, and Misha sort of started to talk about this, is that the consumers, even though it is hard for them to understand what the boundary conditions are for what different assistants can do, they tend to figure it out. And we see this, that a lot of people are using a different voice assistant in their car versus their home versus their phone, because they're developing habits separately in these different contexts. And so whether it's good or bad for people, because I think everyone likes this idea of having the Uber assistant, although I'd say that from a privacy and security standpoint, that might not be obvious. Federated models tend to segment your information and maybe increase privacy, reduce attack surface for bad actors. But right now, what I think of is that we have no problem using 9 apps on a daily basis, 30 apps on a monthly basis, and having 130 apps on our phone and understanding what each can do. And it strikes me that actually the assistants that are coming up are able to do that. And in fact, most of the time, the assistant is not an assistant first, it's a feature first of something else. And so in that case, then we have to look beyond the general purpose assistant to all these other places where we have these specialist assistants. And that for the most part, I think where consumers are actually migrating, and maybe it's just because that's the only option they have, but where they're migrating is not the one assistant, but the multiple assistants as apps.
So what I'm hearing here is that let's say the voice domain is sort of an infinite game, right? Because there's no one assistant to rule them all. I mean, if that has been the case, then Siri would have been the most used voice assistant right now, which we all know it's not the case. So I think where we are going towards is more this, there are a few general purpose assistants which are trying to be good at a lot of things. And, would that end up in three of them, a duopoly or a monopoly over a period of years? It's something that we need to see. But at the same time, like Miha pointed out, there is space for the narrow ones, which are good at doing few things, but does that better, well, which is what the Magenta voice assistant does, right? I mean, if you're a telecom customer, then we make sure that all the telecom things are best served by our assistant. And for us, we also need to then bring it to places where customers are, which would mean sometimes, own touch points, but also sometimes third-party touch points. And this is where, let's say, the interoperability questions start playing up. I mean, some of them are very closed shop, so you cannot get there, but others are completely open. But then adding the complexity on top is, of course, the customer experience. Do people want to now remember multiple wake words, right? Or there is a bit of cognitive overload if you think of to remember which assistant should I talk to what, which is why I really like the approach or the idea of, I think, what Monica, you are proposing with some kind of an open registry. I think there's also work going on in OBN around that, where let's say there is this, whatever we call it, there's some layer that makes sure that discoverability and ease of use or ease of access is there, and that we don't transfer that cognitive overload to the consumers.
I want to, so I agree with what you're saying, Reghu, and I actually want to go back to what Bret said about the number of apps that we have that we use on a daily basis or a monthly basis. What I want to know is how many web pages do the world access in a day? Okay. The part of the reason is that with the phone, we're still relying on the web for a lot of connections to many, many different sources of information and services. But when it comes to voice, how do I get to all these other services? Does it mean that I'm going to now go back to the phone and use a display? Okay, I think that the question is whether you think of it as an addition to what we are already doing, or it is going to be a main user interface, which I believe truly is the right thing, because this is what the technology is about. We already have the technology to make that happen. And I think there is another difference between what you were talking about and what I'm talking about, is that obviously I'm a professor and I want to change the world. I don't want to stick with the status quo. I mean, this is where we are today, but that's not what we want to do, is what I think. If you think that voice is very important today, it is just the beginning. Okay, voice is going to grow even much bigger as the technology gets better. And before long, we would just say, if you look at this, these GUI displays, we will get to a point where it's like, what is that about? It is so much easier if I use voice. So this is how I think that the future has to change, because this technology is that pervasive. I mean, that much more easy and natural than than the GUIs that we have been using all these years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally see your point. I think it might sound very provocative if you think of a future where we don't have any keyboards anymore or any kind of mouses. But I strictly believe in this, because it's a kind of obstacle. If you really face it, if you look at this keyboard, it's an obstacle to quickly communicate with what you would like to achieve. The same holds true for the mouse. If you're going to text on the mobile phone, let's be honest, it sucks. It's maybe for our kids, it's far easier than to us. So to me, it's really super obvious that we will use voice in the near future. When I see at the current initiatives here at the Amazon Voice Interoperability Initiative and at OVAL, what you're pushing forward, Monicar and the OVON, I don't still understand really what is the difference. And my next question is would it be possible that somehow from this, let's say, oligopoly of initiatives, there might will there be soon amalgamate and there will be just like one worldwide voice web consortium? Is that conceivable? Is there any kind of idea here? Bret, what do you think?
My prediction is no, it won't happen. And I think it just has to do with incentives. So the first thing that we have to think about is many of us remember the portal era, right, of the web. Everybody wanted to be the portal, your front door to the internet. AOL tried to do that. They lost because they tried to do too siloed. And
CompuServe as well.
Yeah, right. And then after that, though, but Yahoo and all these other companies who wanted to be open, but they also just wanted to be the front door. And I think the issue with voice assistants is, first of all, we have to think about this from a nuanced standpoint. Sometimes voice is a feature, whether it's an assistant, an agent, an interface, it doesn't matter. Sometimes it's a feature supporting something else. And sometimes it is the actual application that we're going to because it has all these special powers associated with it. So the incentives right now are for people to control the front door of the digital world. For a while, Google was viewed as that, maybe still is, certainly for a specific function it is. Certainly the iPhone has its own claim to fame there for certain contexts. We can just go down the list in terms of all the different things. Even Facebook, right, for a while, I mean, particularly with its multiple solutions, is the front door for many people to engaging through digital services. They all want that. And so the incentives are for everyone who's coming up to grab a piece of that, for everybody who's already there to maintain the status quo. And I think that ultimately those business decisions are much more important to them than the actual best interest of the user. So the best interest of the user, they say, well, it's convenient, it's safe and secure if we do it this way. We don't enter in all of these other variables that we can't control. And so, ultimately, I think that the future that we're looking at is a lot of silos and some interoperability. Now, the one other thing I will say is I firmly believe there will be a independence, we'll say not big tech legacy, an independent voice assistant, which will arise and become very popular as a primary assistant for people. And the reason being is because an assistant that just serves the needs of the user is going to be very compelling because it can go out and get all of these best of breed services to solve problems. Whereas if you look at Amazon, Apple, Google, let's say, sort of the big three in this space, they all look at voice as a feature for their other business. And so there's certain things you can see around their policies, whether it be interoperability or feature sets that they don't enable. It's because they're focused on this idea of serving their other constituencies within their organization. And in that case, then it's too big of a risk for them to do things that might open it up a little bit more and maybe not service that primary objective. So I think we're going to have this hybrid approach, and I kind of feel like that's what we're stuck with. Maybe there's a more optimistic view that Monica or other people here could convince me of, but what I'm seeing right now and what I'm projecting based on incentives is not this completely open network like we saw with the web, probably because of what Reghu said. The standards preceded widespread adoption versus the other way around.
We still have
I'd add a few things to what Bret just said, if I may, and
Please.
With support of Bret's perspective of a hybrid model. But I would suggest this: that yes, those who are controlling the front doors are not going to give that up. But there are all kinds of side doors that are now emerging. Side doors of enterprise assistance, side doors of enterprise voice use that are growing in terms of the complexity, growing in terms of the investment. The analysts are saying here's a 20 to 30% CAGR on a small base, but a 20 to 30% CAGR of investment in enterprise voice conversational AI development. And that's opening up tens, hundreds, thousands of side doors that consumers are going to directly. Now, at some point, and to Bret's point that he made a moment ago, at some point, there's going to be a need for additional value from the general purpose platforms. And those enterprises are going to seek the customers that are in the general purpose platforms. Then you add in something like a Genie that is open source, that offers opportunity, and a hybrid model begins to emerge. So front doors, those locks are going to stay. I don't disagree with Bret at all. But there are side doors that are now emerging within the voice world. Monica?
There's so many topics here. I was thinking, Bret, you're talking about the incentives of the companies to create, to own the front doors. But there are many, many companies who don't like that. Okay, I mean, you can think about all the biggest retailers who are competing with Amazon, and you can think about all the banks that says, well, we don't really want to have a relationship be intermediated because this is all confidential information. There's healthcare, and there are a lot of players who don't like that ecosystem. And if I look at telcos, for example, all these years we have been counting on telcos for letting us communicate without somebody listening in and then serving me ads based on what I am saying on my phone. Can you imagine that, right? And there are a lot of players. There are billion dollar companies who would like to see an open and interoperable world. Where are they? I mean, why can't we get these companies to, maybe each one of them may not be building the agent for like Google and Alexa or Apple, but we want interoperability, and where are they? Why wouldn't it be possible for that to happen? Because the consumers want it.
Well, I'm not sure the consumers do know that they want it, right? So because I do a lot of consumer survey research. So sometimes you have to tell consumers what's possible before they know that they want it, and a lot of them don't do that. But I would just say that I agree with you. There's a lot of organizations that don't like the stranglehold, particularly that the big tech companies have on a lot of these spaces, but they also don't like each other. And so their incentive to collaborate across their industry is fairly low. Now, across other industries, yes. And telecom's a little bit different because it tends to be heavily regulated around the world. They still have competitors, but there's not as many. There's a lot of co-opetition that goes on. But if you look more broadly across industries, their incentives are, yes, to break the stranglehold that maybe big tech has on something, but they also are very wary of sharing any information or any mind space with their direct competitors.
Yeah, so double clicking on that incentives, Bret, I think this is, if you look at telcos, because we talked about telcos, and you're right, I think regulated is what keeps us, let's say, sticking to some of those things which we need to, because that's how we do business. Whereas there are a lot of others who don't play by those rules, right? Which then makes this whole, like, how do you invest and compete, at that level, while from a consumer point of view, they expect similar kind of, let's say, experience, right? They don't really care if we have, let's say, 500 developers working against 10,000 developers, all working towards a similar level of customer experience, which is why I kind of like the direction where we are going with respect to, can we somehow bring a more neutral technology that kind of, is not keeping the front door, but rather allows for a lot of doors to be open. The biggest question that I have is, how are we going to make that accessible? I mean, will that get adopted? I think this is really the key question, because again, going back to that, do standards come before implementation? I think in our case, some of these ecosystems have been well established, right? I mean, there are these big ones, and how do you now, like John mentioned, have these side doors open, that it's not just some kind of thing that exists where nobody knows, but rather it gets used? I think that's the biggest question mark in my head, that maybe we need to kind of fast forward 10 years to see where we are. But at least I don't have an answer right now in terms of, if you put something like that out there, are people going to use it?
Bret, I was going to say that right now, at this very moment, we've got representatives from about 15 companies in a room open to all, trying to crack this code of interoperability, however we define that. Now, but to your point, it's not 100 companies, it's 15. And those are companies from the States and from Western Europe. But we do have people that are coming together to address this issue. But we need more momentum, we need more growth, we need more push across the enterprise world. But the issues that Monica identified, issues of data use, issues of data respect, issues of build it once and use it many, from the enterprise side, those are very real, and we know that they are. But it's, Bret, to your point, it's moving past the incentives and the hesitance to share and bringing people together on that.
So academia is one of the few places where we like to share. Okay, I don't have the incentives to keep the technology to ourselves, and everything we are doing is open source. And I think that the idea is we can work together. Okay, voice is a field where the technology is still so hard that you can actually make changes to its development, and it will make it a lot more accessible. So, for example, what we do is that everything is open source. We have tools, and you can apply it to your space. And we also put out all the open source software and data sets and so forth. So, for example, we have built a virtual assistant with about 10 top most used skills. And we are able to do that even with a small team because of the tools that we have. And once we have, for example, built a music skill, it is out there. This skill is designed in such a way that you can substitute the back end of that database with something totally different. And the same source, the same neural network can be used for different music services. And if we put all these open source neural networks out there, we can enable tons of people to make their own music services, or whatever space that we get into. If you look at the top 10, we're talking about the restaurant recommendation skills and so forth. They're all open. Okay, and if we can get more support for this kind of effort, there will be a lot more software out there that people can just adopt. And they can put their music services or their restaurant reservation and so forth on top of the technology. And I think that if it is easy to populate the, if you have the content, then that will make a difference. Because now, on top of that, we have also built an assistant that can interface to all these different contents. Then we have a neutral assistant that has, and we all know that content is king. And I think it is this combination of making it easy for a lot of people to build skills, put it up on their website, put it up on their phone line and whatever. And then you say, here is also an open source virtual assistant that can give you all these services. And it is open. That means that anybody else can build on top of it and contribute to it. I think that might be an alternative.
You're making a very interesting point, Monica. I mean, this is something that we are now trying, is how can we liberate our own assistant, which kind of was in the speakers and remote controls, and kind of put that on other touch points. So what we are currently doing is, making it available on the telephone line or the telephone network for use cases like, enterprise use cases like appointment scheduling for doctors and such. So this is something that we are currently beta testing in Germany, and I'm eager to see the customer reaction to that before we kind of make it bigger. But this is, I think that's already kind of bringing it out of well-established touch points. And here, I think telcos have a unique advantage that then the networks being kind of open, the more we bring in there, it's not getting tied to an particular ecosystem. But again, then it becomes a telco space. So this is a very interesting thing that we are currently exploring. And I'm really curious to see how this space will evolve, like John said, into more enterprise kind of use case as well. I mean, the good thing about voice is the amount of use cases you can voice enable is endless. I mean, just take anything, you can add a voice interface or a voice assistant or kind of this proactiveness like Bret mentioned. What matters to us as business at the end is the amount of investment that you need to do and what kind of ROI do we get on that, which, for example, could be either the number of people using it or the revenue that you can generate out of it. And this is where I believe the whole incentive is a very important discussion to have, and how can we really broaden it up beyond our own let's say, ecosystems that we are currently looking at.
My thinking from Swisscom, if I may just wave in for a quick, so there are several things which were mentioned. I agree with Bret on the point that voice is in many cases just a feature add-on. If I may go just one small step back, and in some other cases it is a separate app and separate product. What we didn't touch today, which I think is important for interoperability, is the privacy topic. Having multiple assistants and working them together, that's great, but how do you present it in some standardized ways to the customer? For us in Swisscom is super important, like for any other telco, that the data and anything in terms of the user privacy is super transparent. So I'm just thinking, when we talk about interoperability, why we not solve the problems which we have and not just solving the problems which might come? And maybe introducing standards would actually mean just starting with some of them and then extending them to the vast majority of whatever voice topics. This is in my head. Just let's start with something. Let's motivate telcos like Deutsche Telekom, my own company, to be part of it. We were part of some open standards because not only that we believed in that, it's more, it takes more for telco to be part of some open standards just to believe in that. It has to work with what we are trying to do and has to motivate us, and then you have all our hearts and we work together to the common cause. We even contribute to that, but give us some solution. Or sometimes from academia comes the great ideas, and this is where telcos come on board for this train which is running forward and brings value to all of us. We can't just develop the voice just for the sake of voice. It has to bring the value to our customers. It has to extend the user experience. It has to do, I don't know, whatever Amazon is using it to redirect their customers to their shops and all this stuff. Give us that opportunity and we are fully on board. At the moment, it looks really interesting, but I think the first step would, in my opinion, come from academia or OVN or something, and then we are all on board.
Thanks, Misha.
Wonderful.
I'd like to spend the last minutes on the future. So from each of you, I'd like to have a little highlight. So how will the voice future look like in 10 years? And when you look back from this 10 years, what was the single tipping point that made this future possible? Bret.
Okay, so you make me go first, so everyone else gets a chance to think about this. I think actually the most interesting thing that I'm looking forward is not necessarily that we're just going to have ambient voice assistants everywhere. I think that is a general trend that we're seeing, that we're seeing more access to voice in more places, more devices, and so it's going to be pervasive. I think the more interesting thing to me is the rise of these proactive voice agents or voice assistant type agency, and they will, ultimately be moving us more along that path of convenience. And because what they'll be able to do is they'll be able to anticipate our needs or have general guidance around what we care about and taking care of things before we even think to do a request response type of interaction. And so 10 years, I think that's reasonable. It's going to be probably 5 years before we see something that is decent in that regard. But once it happens, I think you're not going to have that long for it to be adopted, because it will be a standalone application that will be for you, will fulfill your needs, and as long as people can develop trust in it, and that it'll be very widely adopted, and it'll be adopted more quickly if there is widespread interoperability for a lot of services that it can tap into.
Thanks. John.
I would echo what Bret said. I think he's spot on. The other thing I'd add to what Bret said, and Bret, thank you for going first because it did give me a chance to think. The other thing would be the role of voice and the growth of voice and the needs for interoperability in the immersive gaming world. I'm not going to call it the metaverse, but I think this is going to get very interesting very quickly, changing the shape of entertainment and media as we know it. even more so than now, and that's a 5 to 7 year horizon as well.
Thanks. Monica, your view of the future.
Yeah, I want to say two things. The first one here is that voice is going to be a good extension of how we interface to software. Okay, so for example, we're working with the group in civil engineering, and we are adding the voice to their interfaces to all the building information, and you don't have to mess with the GUIs, and you can just talk and you can get all the 3D information of the building that you are in, and so forth. And we see that voice is just going to be, you will, it's a replacement of the GUI in general. So that's the first part. So that is going to go into work, go into, just anything that you're using the computer for. In the meantime, if you look at the personal side, I think that people will have these these earbuds. Okay, you can imagine that putting them on and you just go about your business, and you get to information on the entire web anytime you want. And it's going to get very personal, by the way, because it intermediates like all the kinds of different things you are dealing with. And it will provide a lot of help, like what Bret is saying, it's going to be proactive. And if you look farther out, the movie Her, okay? And it's absolutely going to be the case that we will like to have a trusted companion. And I think this is part of the reason why I think it is very important that we make voice open and available to everybody.
Thanks. Misha.
So I'm just looking and thinking from the perspective of Swisscom, and maybe I'm just a bit limited from that perspective, because what I think it will change definitely is the search behavior. This is where I see that people will use more voice to search a different content, maybe e-commerce site, maybe we are talking about media and everything. What I miss today, and I believe that it still need another shift in voice, is anything in terms of security, better recognition for wide area of applications, in terms of recognizing and having a fingerprint for the voice. I know that today is possible, but not for the wide range of use cases and users. I also, what is important for us, especially in Switzerland, it's a special, maybe a bit special case, let's say like this, multiple languages. Nobody wants to take with which language you want to talk. We want to be able to mix languages and to search. We want to have simple voice assistant. We want to be able not to train our customers to use the voice assistant. Today, we do have to do that. We have to show them, hey, this is what you have. First, we tried, okay, just use it, but this doesn't work. You really need, somebody mentioned that, and I echo that. I'm expecting another paradigm shift in that way. Also, what is important for our topic, as a last point from my side, we would like to use the components in terms of technology best of breed. I would like to be able to connect in terms of mixing dialogue with ASR in a better way, not developing custom connections between the components and stitching them together. I wish that I have a possibility, and I think this should change with what I heard today, to easily attach open source dialogue and using open source ASR, whatever, or at least support open source APIs. I understand that the point today is to develop custom. So many technologies started like that in computer worlds, like, I don't know, Amiga or something like that. They were great, but they were not open. And that's where they ran. So I wish to see that voice is taking that leap of faith together with us on the telco side of the business.
Thanks, Misha. Reghu, what's your image of the future.
Sure. I mean, since Monica went for 2 things, I think I'll go for 3 things. So, I mean, 10 years is a pretty long time for technology to become super mature. I think the problems that we see today with noisy conditions, background noise, and all those, let's say, technical challenges, I think that'll be solved. And I think technology will be really mature, will be cheaper and democratized, meaning access to a lot of people, which basically brings me to the second point, which is once you have that, you will see a far higher adoption in the business and enterprise use cases. So I think it'll, all the consumer focusing that we're doing today will lead more and more into more enterprise use cases. But I think the most important thing that will happen in the next 10 years is the generational shift. So the biggest problem that we are seeing today is people stick to existing behaviors. It's hard for people to change the fact that they keep pressing the remote control. So they keep pressing the remote control keys rather than using the voice button on it and then use their voice to talk. And when I see kids of today, including my own kids, and how natural they interact with it and how much they actually interact with these voice AIs, I think this will definitely be the biggest, let's say, change in terms of seeing a much higher adoption. And I really hope that 10 years is quite a long time to eventually get us there in terms of the adoption.
Yeah. Thanks, Reghu. Thanks to all the panelists for your contributions. I'd like to wrap it up in the last 2 minutes. So what we've learned today is that we are in an infinite game. So, and the amount of voice use cases are almost endless. So, and we have talked about proactive voice assistants that proactively might address user needs without the users themselves knowing it. So what we know from science from MIT is also that the voice is transporting up to 25 different biomarkers, so that our voice is sometimes does know more about ourselves than we know. So I think that there's a lot of very powerful use cases behind there. Of course, we have to look at the data privacy here. So another idea would be to go more in the direction of a trusted companion. So something what we have seen in the movie Her a couple of years ago. When it comes to designing own voice services that addresses more like the CTO, CIO perspective, it's important to structure and to differentiate between voice interface, voice system, or voice assistant. So which all need an extra effort to produce and to put resources in there. So, and a standard is never made by a single person or organization. And what we know that voice is just too big to be controlled by a single person or party. When it comes to the business perspective, John highlighted that when we look at all these statistics from different partners and agencies, we have on average 20% CAGR, which makes it quite very interesting also economic wise. And of course, when we look at the single powerful players here, they're still looking for a front door strategy, trying to grab a piece of the great economic cake here. Yeah, one thing is clear: we cannot give up voice, as with telephony, digital technology, file formats, or any other technology. Sooner or later, an all-encompassing standard will prevail, as it was true for telephony, for any kind of digital devices, for the World Wide Web. And which one that is remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, however, it stays exciting. So thanks a lot for your participation, for your very much appreciated contributions. You on the screens, thanks a lot for attending. Please stay tuned, have a look at voicification.ai in order to get all the info about voicification activities of the Deutsche Telekom. Have a look there, visit us, and otherwise, we wish you a very nice evening. Talk soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
It was a pleasure.